Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today we'll take a look into the complicated past of the Dursley family. You'll learn about hidden grudges, unspoken words, secret hopes, and the reasons why these people feared magic so much. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Petunia's grudge and the rift with her sister. From Snape's memories, we only know a small number of Petunia Evans's story. After Lily received her letter from Hogwarts, the sisters' paths began to diverge. But Severus Snape, like many others, never knew the most important detail. Petunia held a grudge against their parents. She was convinced that Mum and Dad loved Lily more just because she was special. Petunia, on the other hand, remained ordinary. Out of bitterness and jealousy, she chose to leave her hometown and start a new life. Number 2. Meeting Vernon and the beginning of a normal life. In London, Petunia got a job at an office where she met Vernon Dursley, everything she believed to be normal. He dreamed of a house, a new car, and a quiet life far from anything strange. Petunia saw in him a sense of security and a salvation from the world of magic. When Vernon found out the truth about Petunia's sister, he didn't make much of it. He reassured his fiancée that her being related to a witch wouldn't affect their relationship. Number 3. The ill-fated dinner, meeting Lily and James. But an attempt to bring the two families together turned into a disaster. At one table sat Petunia, Vernon, Lily, and James. From the very first minutes, it was clear this would not end well. When Vernon innocently asked what kind of car James drove, James jokingly spoke about his racing broom. Vernon took it as mockery and sarcastically suggested that wizards must live on government handouts. James didn't stay silent and proudly began describing the gold in his Gringotts vault. Tension escalated quickly. Vernon was offended and stormed out of the restaurant with Petunia. Neither of them wanted further contact. Lily was upset, and James promised he'd try to fix things someday. But Vernon remained firm, and Petunia never invited Lily to be her maid of honor. They didn't attend the Potters' wedding either. Number 4. A life without magic and the torn letter. Petunia was content. She finally had a normal house, a normal family, and no vanishing objects. She moved into Vernon's home and immersed herself in normality. The last reminder of Lily was a letter about Harry's birth. Petunia tore it up and threw it away, not even bothering to reply. They never spoke again. Number 5. Harry in the Dursley household. As we know, after Lily and James's death, Harry ended up at the Dursleys' house. Petunia took him in not out of love, but more from a sense of duty. She tried her best to erase Lily from her life, but every time she looked at Harry, she was reminded of her sister. And it hurt. Vernon, from day one, was hostile toward Harry, largely because the boy looked so much like James, the man Vernon had never reconciled with. Number 6. Petunia's hidden dream. In one interview, Rowling admitted that as a child, Petunia secretly hoped magic would manifest in her too. She wanted to go to Hogwarts just like Lily. This hidden disappointment and sense of injustice gave rise to her coldness and sharpness. Her constant reproaches toward Harry weren't so much malice as they were a projection of her own pain. She envied Lily, was ashamed of her envy, and at the same time hated herself for being unable to forgive. Number 7. Farewell to Harry, a moment of truth. The scene where Petunia says goodbye to Harry became a symbolic moment for many. People expected more from her, tears, a hug, words of regret. But Petunia stayed true to herself, dry, restrained, hiding her emotions behind a cold mask. Rowling explained that Petunia simply didn't know how to express emotion, but at that moment, looking into Harry's eyes, perhaps for the last time, she saw her sister in them, and it touched her, even if she didn't say a word. Number 8. Secret correspondence with Dumbledore. Letter was written in shaking hands. Petunia Dursley had never begged anyone for anything. But after one of Harry's accidental outbursts, when the kitchen table flipped without warning, she sat at the dining room late at night and wrote to Albus Dumbledore, Her words were clipped, furious. "Come, take him. He doesn't belong here. I can't do this anymore." She sent it through the same old owl that had arrived when Harry was a baby. Days later, a reply came. Long, graceful strokes of ink on thick parchment. Dumbledore's message was calm but firm. "You accepted him into your home and by doing so saved his life. As long as he is under your roof, your blood protects him more powerfully than any spell I could cast." Petunia read that sentence again and again. Your blood protects him. She had never considered it before, that she, plain magicless Petunia, was now the shield keeping her sister's child alive. It was more than duty. It was sacred. She didn't respond to Dumbledore's letter, but she folded it carefully and hid it in the back of her wardrobe, between her wedding photos and a pressed flower from childhood. She never asked again to send Harry away, because now she understood. Even in silence, even in resentment, she had been chosen to protect him. And deep down that meant something, something more than she could ever admit. Number 9. Why Vernon feared magic. Vernon Dursley never spoke of his cousin Malcolm, not at dinners, not at holidays, not even when Petunia asked why he flinched at the mention of strange people. But years before Harry Potter entered his life, Vernon had seen something that left a mark. Malcolm was a quiet boy, odd even by family standards. At one birthday party, Vernon teased him. Nothing cruel, just a joke about his mismatched socks. Malcolm's face turned red. The room felt cold. And in the next moment, Vernon's eyebrows were gone, not burned, not shaved, just vanished. The laughter died instantly. Vernon touched his forehead and screamed. His mother dragged him to the bathroom. His father locked Malcolm in the pantry. No one ever mentioned it again. But Vernon remembered. He remembered the silence, the way no one looked him in the eye, the way his mother whispered, "That boy isn't right." From that day, Vernon made a quiet vow. There would be no surprises in his life, no oddities, no people who changed the rules of the world. Years later, when Petunia told him about her sister being a witch, he nodded, calm on the surface. But inside, that old memory stirred. "We'll have no nonsense here," he would snap in Philosopher's Stone. But what he meant was, we'll have no Malcolm, no fear, no magic in this house. Ever. Number 10. Dudley and his hidden jealousy. Dudley. Dursley had everything. Toys, second helpings, his parents' constant praise. But what he didn't have was their obsession. That was reserved for Harry. Every move Harry made, every word he spoke, Petunia and Vernon noticed. "Why is he even here?" Dudley would mutter. But deep down, it stung. The way they whispered about Harry behind closed doors. The way they locked him in the cupboard but still gave him more attention than they ever gave Dudley's questions, fears, or silence. Years later, Dudley told a friend in confidence he could do magic, they hated it, but at least they looked at him. It all changed the night of the Dementor attack. Dudley was left shivering, gasping, unable to explain what he'd felt. But Harry knew. Harry had saved him. That night, as they stood in the dark, something cracked inside Dudley. The boy he had bullied, who wore rags and slept beneath the stairs, had turned out to be brave. "I don't think you're a waste of space," Dudley mumbled before leaving Privet Drive. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first real thing he had ever said to Harry. And it came not from guilt, but from a truth Dudley had carried in secret for years, that he had always envied the cousin he pretended to despise. Number 11. The unspoken connection between Petunia and Snape. It was an afternoon like any other, back when Spinner's End was just a name Petunia barely remembered. She had come looking for Lily, but found Severus Snape instead, sitting alone on a patch of dry grass, waiting. She was about to walk away, but something in his eyes stopped her. He looked like a boy carrying too many secrets. They spoke quietly, at first awkwardly. But then Severus said, If I weren't a wizard, Lily wouldn't talk to me." The words hung in the air longer than either expected. Petunia didn't know how to answer. She had always feared that very same thing, that without magic, Lily would drift away from both of them. In that shared insecurity, something unspoken passed between them. For a moment, it felt like they could have been friends. Two outsiders watching the same fire from opposite sides. But when Severus got his Hogwarts letter and Lily's eyes lit up brighter than ever before, that thread snapped. Petunia watched them walk toward the future, hand in hand, leaving her behind with her envy and silence. She never spoke to Snape again, not out of anger but fear of feeling that unwanted again. From then on, she decided, no wizards, no magic, no more hope. She built walls, Severus went through his, and neither of them ever looked back. Number 12. Petunia's secret visit to Godric's Hollow. It was the winter of Harry's second year at Hogwarts. Vernon thought she had gone to visit an old school friend, but Petunia took a train north, alone, clutching a scarf she hadn't worn in decades. She didn't ask for directions. She knew the name, Godric's Hollow. She remembered it from a single line in Dumbledore's letter. Snow covered the path, the trees whispering in the wind. She stood before the ruined cottage, the roof caved in, the front door still broken. A plaque now stood nearby, scrawled over with messages to Harry. She didn't read them. She stepped closer. Her gloved hand touched the crumbling fence. Her breath caught. The last time she had seen her sister, they were both still alive, young, angry, talking over one another at a dinner that ended in silence. Petunia looked at the blackened windows. She whispered, "I hated you because they loved you more. I envied you because you had something I never would, but I never wanted this." Her voice cracked. "Forgive me, Lily." And for the first time in years, she cried, not the sharp, bitter tears she hid from Vernon, but real ones, the kind that leave you empty and new all at once. She left a single white flower on the steps, a lily, then turned and walked away. By the time she got home, her mask was back on. She made roast beef for dinner, told Vernon the trains were late. Never spoke of the trip, but something had shifted. After that winter, she didn't speak ill of Harry as often. She folded his laundry instead of throwing it on his bed. Small things, silent things. But something inside her had thawed, a memory, perhaps, of two girls in a garden, not yet broken by the weight of magic. Number 13, Petunia's final gift to Harry. After the last guest had left and the candles had burned low, Harry found it. A small envelope, unmarked, resting quietly on the edge of the long table where the wedding gifts had been piled. No one saw who placed it there. No return owl, no magic trace. Just a simple slip of paper holding a photo inside, faded at the corners, but unmistakably real. Two girls, no older than 7, grinning in the sunlight, barefoot in a garden. Lily held a daisy chain in her hand. Petunia was mid-laugh, her arms slung around her little sister's shoulders like they had no idea the world would ever change. On the back, a single line in delicate, careful handwriting. "Let yours be what we never had." No name, no signature. But Harry knew. He ran his fingers along the old photograph and tried to remember a time he never lived through. Petunia had never spoken those words, but perhaps she had always wanted to. This was not an apology. It wasn't affection. It was something more fragile, the quiet hope of someone who had run out of ways to speak. He placed the photo inside his jacket pocket, next to his heart. Years later, when Lily Luna asked him who the other girl in the picture was, Harry only said, "Someone who once loved your grandmother very much." He never spoke of the letter again, but on quiet nights, when Ginny had gone to bed and the house fell still, Harry would sometimes take out the photo. He didn't cry, he didn't smile, he just looked, and listened to the silence between two sisters, finally trying to heal, Number 14. Petunia's fear of owls. When the first owl came crashing into the kitchen window of the Evans family home, it wasn't carrying just a letter. It carried the beginning of Petunia's lifelong fear. The bird shattered a delicate vase, her mother's most cherished possession, inherited from Petunia's grandmother. The water spilled across the floor. The vase hit the tiles with a dull, final crack. It was Lily's letter from Hogwarts. Petunia never forgot how her mother's eyes flared with anger. "This is your sister's nonsense again," she snapped. But it was Petunia who got the blame. She was the one who had been talking about magic just days before, and now magic had quite literally broken into their home. From that moment on, owls were no longer just birds in the night. They were symbols of disruption, of shame, of chaos she couldn't control. Every time one flew past in later years, Petunia would instinctively flinch. And when letters for Harry began to arrive by owl, sometimes in dozens at once, her fear exploded into fury. "No more of these," she barked, snatching a letter from the bird's beak with trembling hands. It wasn't just about keeping magic out. It was about keeping control. "There's no such thing as magic," she had once told Harry, her voice cold, rehearsed. But deep down, she knew it wasn't true. Magic was real, and magic had ruined everything. The books don't dwell on Petunia's memories, but the shadows are there. In the Philosopher's Stone, when Uncle Vernon tries to escape the letters, it's Petunia who begins to unravel. "They knew we'd moved house," she shrieks. "How could they possibly know where he is?" That wasn't just fear, it was panic, the kind that comes from knowing the pattern. She had lived it before, with Lily, with the vase, with the shame in her mother's eyes. She knew magic would always find a way in, no matter how many locks Vernon changed. Petunia's fear of owls wasn't absurd. It was personal. Every wing beat reminded her of the day she lost control of her world, and of the moment she realized Lily had truly crossed into another life, a life she wasn't allowed to follow. Magic, to Petunia, didn't knock. It crashed through the window and left the pieces behind. Number 15, Petunia's one and only letter to Hogwarts. Before Lily Evans ever unwrapped her Hogwarts letter with trembling fingers and tear-filled eyes, her older sister had already taken a quieter, more desperate step toward that very same world. Petunia Evans, barely 11 and already weighed down by the strange isolation that comes from being ordinary in an extraordinary family, had written a letter to Hogwarts. It was not a prank nor a joke. It was a sincere and deeply vulnerable plea, composed in secret by candlelight in their shared bedroom in Cokeworth, on a day when Lily had been gone playing in the woods with Severus Snape. Petunia had seen her sister levitate a pebble. She had heard the word witch whispered with excitement and fear, and she had known, though no one had said it outright, that Lily belonged to a world where Petunia never would. The letter she wrote was long. It was not eloquent in a literary sense, but it carried a rawness that would have wounded anyone with the heart to read between the lines. She confessed to watching from behind curtains and stair rails, witnessing Lily's growing strangeness that sparkled rather than disturbed. She admitted that though she teased her sister and rolled her eyes, a hidden part of her hoped that if Lily could be magic, maybe she could too. She begged for information, for truth, for a glimmer of hope. "I only want to know if there's a chance," she wrote. "If I can learn, if it's possible, I want to be special too." Her handwriting shook as she folded the paper, heart pounding like a fugitive's. She addressed the envelope in careful script, copying the format she'd seen on Lily's first invitation when it arrived months later. Petunia Evans, number 4, Spinner's End Road, Cokeworth. She didn't know if it was the right address, only that it felt like the kind of detail magic would notice. She walked alone to the mailbox, looking over her shoulder the whole way, and dropped the letter in as if it were cursed. Weeks passed. There was no response. She tried to forget it, bury the memory beneath mockery and denial. But then on a rainy Tuesday, when Lily was away and the house felt emptier than usual, an envelope arrived, thick, yellowish parchment, emerald green ink. Her heart leapt before logic could intervene. She opened it in her room, hands trembling, stomach filled with hot lightning. The letter was short. It bore the seal of Hogwarts, and at the bottom, in fine, graceful handwriting, was the name Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. But the words above it were sharp as needles. "Miss Evans," it said, "thank you for your interest in the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Regrettably, our assessment confirms that you do not possess the required magical capacity to enroll." Magic is not a skill that can be taught by desire or hard work. It is born within. We understand this may be disappointing, but we trust you will find your own path toward excellence. It was as brutal as it was formal. The paper may as well have screamed, "You are not, and never will be, one of us." Petunia sat with that letter for hours. She read it again and again, eyes dry and red-rimmed. It wasn't merely the rejection that broke her. It was the finality of it, the confirmation that magic had noticed her, weighed her, and discarded her as unworthy. Even worse, someone had read her words, her secret longing, her shame, and returned them with an institutional dismissal. She was not a witch, not even close. She burned the letter. No one would ever know, not Lily, not her parents, and certainly not Vernon Dursley, the man she would someday marry, the man who hated all things unusual, who thought normal was the highest compliment and magic a filthy word. She never told him. In fact, she told no one. That silence became armor. Over time, even she forgot some of the details. But the wound stayed open, quietly infecting everything she touched. Years later, she would sit on a beige sofa in Little Whinging, gripping a porcelain cup of tea as Albus Dumbledore visited her home and explained that her nephew, the boy with his mother's eyes, had to be protected under the terms of an ancient magical bond. In that moment, she almost told him. The memory of her own letter to Hogwarts flared like a buried ember, but she remained silent, staring at the wall. Dumbledore, as always, seemed to understand more than she said aloud. "You did not just loathe her," he once told Harry, "you envied her." But he never knew the full extent of that envy. No one did. The irony was cruel. Petunia had wanted so desperately to belong to that world, to feel that tingle in her fingers, that hum in her bones, and yet she had become its bitterest enemy, not because she hated magic, but because she loved it enough to mourn it, loved it enough to twist that grief into resentment. When she locked Harry in the cupboard beneath the stairs, it wasn't malice that guided her, it was fear of what he was and fear of what she was not. The only person who ever came close to understanding was Severus Snape. As a child, he had watched Petunia from afar, sneering at her vanity but recognizing with cruel clarity the ache behind her sharp tongue. "You're just a muggle," he told her once, and the word had stung more than a slap. Muggle, powerless, irrelevant. In a world where one sister could fly and the other could only watch from the ground, that word became a curse, number 16, when magic crashed their wedding. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipping through the brass flap of the Dursleys' door with the rest of the morning mail. There was nothing outwardly unusual about it, thick parchment, a wax seal, written in emerald green ink. But Vernon Dursley froze when he saw it. His hands trembled, not because he knew what it was, but because he feared what it might be. For Vernon, anything outside the known and perfectly predictable realm of middle-class suburban life was a threat. And this letter smelled of something he had banished from thought, conversation, and most importantly, his life with Petunia Evans. That word, the one he dared not say aloud, magic. He tore it open before she could stop him. His face turned a violent shade of purple as he read the ornate handwriting. It was an invitation, a formal, wax-stamped invitation to a wedding ceremony. But not just any wedding. It was a Hogwarts wedding between two magical folk whose names Vernon didn't recognize, yet that hardly mattered. The mere mention of the castle, the broomstick-shaped insignia, and the phrase, "Headmaster Albus Dumbledore cordially invites you," was enough to send him into one of his infamous rages. He stormed into the kitchen, clutching the letter like evidence in a trial, demanding an explanation. "Are you in contact with her again?" he had roared. "You swore, Petunia!" Petunia tried to deny it, of course. She insisted she hadn't spoken to Lily in years, that it must be a mistake, a clerical error. "Oh, they must have confused our address," she stammered, but her voice lacked the convincing tone Vernon needed to hear. The damage was done. The fragile peace they had built over their engagement, a peace constructed on avoidance, suppression, and brittle denial, had shattered. Vernon didn't cancel the wedding, but the air between them grew dense and hard, like unspoken storm clouds. The letter, though soon burned in the fireplace, left behind the acrid smell of suspicion. What no one knew, not even Vernon, and especially not Lily, was that Petunia had once written to Dumbledore herself, long ago, as a child. She had begged for admission to Hogwarts, pleaded that her blood be tested, that her normalcy be re-evaluated. "She's my sister," she had written. "There must be something in me too." Dumbledore, kind as ever, had written back, kindly but firmly declining. She kept the letter for years, folded into a silk scarf at the bottom of her drawer. She had burned it only a month before her engagement. But some part of the world remembered magic had not forgotten her name. As the wedding approached, tensions mounted. Vernon was never the most affectionate man, but now he became guarded, curt, watchful. Petunia caught him glancing through her belongings when he thought she wasn't looking. He checked the return addresses on the letters she received. She knew he was still thinking about that Hogwarts invitation. It didn't help that her eyes, though tired from planning the seating chart and choosing flowers, still lingered wistfully on a certain unopened drawer in her nightstand. Inside it lay a compact mirror, small, round, framed in gold, with a crack that ran across its centre like a fault line. Lily had given it to her when they were girls, before their final summer together. "It's charmed," Lily had whispered, eyes gleaming with secret knowledge. "So we can see each other, no matter where we are." Petunia had laughed in her face, but she took the mirror anyway. And when Lily left for Hogwarts that autumn, Petunia would sometimes, alone in her room, open the mirror and whisper, "You there?" Of course, nothing happened, at least not then, but she never threw it away. On the day of the wedding, the skies above Surrey were cloudless. Everything looked perfect. The church had been decorated in whites and pale pinks. Vernon wore his best suit, his moustache trimmed to military precision. Petunia's gown was ivory, long-sleeved, modest, chosen with care to match the image she wanted to present, the image of a woman who had no secrets, no shadows, trailing her down the aisle. But inside her handbag, tucked among tissues and a pressed flower from Lily's old garden, the little mirror sat like a weight, a silent contradiction to everything her marriage was supposed to symbolize. When the vows were spoken, Petunia's voice cracked. No one noticed, except for Vernon, who flinched. Her hand trembled slightly as she accepted the ring. In the photos, her smile is strained, her eyes glassy. The reception was polite, conservative, and devoid of music. Petunia's friends complimented her dress. Vernon's colleagues admired the champagne. But when Petunia sneaked away for a moment to freshen up, she pulled the mirror from her bag and stared into it. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Something inside her hoped Lily would know that wherever she was, she might also be holding her half of the mirror. Just for a moment. That night, the mirror glowed faintly. It was the faintest shimmer, like moonlight on water. Petunia thought she imagined it, but she didn't move. She sat on the edge of her hotel bed, staring into the glass as if it could transport her somewhere, or someone else. Lily, by then, was already married, pregnant even, living in Godric's Hollow. But she, too, had once kept her half of the mirror, and some part of Petunia believed that maybe, just maybe, Lily still had it, tucked between baby booties and spell books. Maybe she had glanced at it that night, just once. The day after the wedding, Vernon told her he wanted no more talk of that world. He said it in a tone that brooked no argument. That world was no longer allowed in the Dursley household, in conversation, in memory. Petunia nodded and agreed. She told herself she had chosen this life, that magic was behind her, that it had only ruined things, that Lily had abandoned her. But her fingers continued to trace the edges of the mirror long after Vernon had fallen asleep beside her. She never told him she still had it. Number 17, the ban on saying Lily at home. Of all the unspeakable truths inside number 4, Privet Drive, none was more suffocating than the ban on a single name, Lily. After Dudley Dursley was born, Petunia had drawn a silent curtain over the memory of her sister. It was not a gradual fading, nor a gentle grieving. It was swift, cold, and final. Lily Evans ceased to exist within the walls of the Dursley home. No photographs adorned the walls, no dusty keepsake was hidden in an attic box. Even the syllables of her name were treated like poison, too bitter for the air of little whinging. Harry, who was still a baby swaddled in clothes too big for him, was the last ghostly remnant of a woman erased by a sister's pain. Petunia Dursley was not a cruel woman in the traditional sense. She did not cackle over cauldrons or curse the innocent. Her cruelty was quiet, surgical. It lived in omission rather than commission. She did not need to strike Harry to wound him. She simply removed the history he was owed. Her decision to banish Lily's name from the household came during a single winter night, months after Harry was left on the doorstep. Dudley had just begun teething. Vernon was sipping tea. Petunia, folding laundry in the next room, dropped a tiny blue bib and stared at it for several minutes. When she returned, she announced without inflection that the house was not to tolerate any mention of her sister again. Not in front of Dudley, not in front of Harry, not at all. Vernon, who harboured no deep feelings toward his sister-in-law, merely grunted. "Name like any other," he muttered, but one glance at Petunia's clenched jaw was enough. He never spoke the name again. Years later, when Dudley asked if Harry had any family, Vernon turned the question into a joke about Harry having been grown in a test tube. Petunia said nothing. She merely left the room and returned with tea, her mouth a pale line, her eyes damp but unreadable. Harry grew up with a hollowness he could never name. Children asked about their mothers at school. Some drew them in crayon. Others spoke of lullabies and kisses on scraped knees. When Harry tried to recall anything about his own, there was nothing, no songs, no smell, no whispered words. The only truth he had was absence. It wasn't that Lily Potter was dead. It was that Lily Potter had never existed at all, not within the realm where Harry was allowed to live. Her memory had been cauterized, sanitized out of every corner of his upbringing. Even her name, a sound so short and simple, was treated like treason. The closest Harry ever came to discovering her was in the smallest of rebellions. At night, when the cupboard was too dark and the air too still, he would whisper the name to himself. He'd seen it once, on a yellowed letter curled in the edge of a cracked envelope tucked deep in a drawer that he wasn't supposed to open. Lily Potter. He whispered it like a spell, like something ancient and sacred. And in that whisper, she was real. She existed, but only for him. Never for the Dursleys. On his 8th birthday, After a particularly brutal day of chasing Dudley's gang around the park, only to be blamed for their scraped knees, Harry sat alone on the garden bench. The sun was beginning to set. The hydrangeas Petunia, tended with such vigour, stood heavy with blue blooms. Harry turned to her as she pruned the bushes and asked, "Why doesn't anyone talk about my mum?" The shears in her hand paused mid-air. For a long moment there was no sound but the wind rattling the fence. Then she turned, looked him directly in the eyes, those same green eyes that haunted her, and said, in a voice hoarse with something deeper than anger, "Because talking hurts more than silence." That sentence never left Harry. At the time, he didn't grasp its weight. It sounded like a riddle, or perhaps an excuse. But years later, standing before her grave, those words returned, heavy and solemn. Talking hurts more than silence. In that one sentence, Petunia had betrayed the truth. She had loved her sister once, loved her enough for the loss to tear her open. And rather than bleed openly, she chose to seal the wound, shut with denial. When Harry finally arrived at Hogwarts and the world of magic unfolded like a long-denied inheritance, it was through others that he reconstructed the person of Lily. Professor McGonagall spoke of her with a kind of wistful admiration. Hagrid cried openly when he gave Harry the photo album filled with moving pictures, and Dumbledore, with all his secrets and manipulations, still offered truths that Petunia never dared to approach. But it was from Severus Snape in the end that Harry learned who Lily had truly been: clever, bold, fiercely loyal, a friend, a fighter, and someone whom Snape had loved in the same breath as he hated James Potter. What Harry never told anyone was that he often wondered if Petunia had a single photograph left. Just one, perhaps hidden in a drawer under old tea towels or tucked behind a rarely opened book. Did she, in her quietest hours, pull it out? Did she look at it and remember, or had she truly banished her sister from her soul as thoroughly as from her house? Harry would never know, but he suspected that for all her coldness, Petunia was haunted by memory as much as he was by absence. Number 18, Petunia's fear of Dumbledore. The night Albus Dumbledore left Harry Potter on the doorstep of number 4 Privet Drive, something stirred in Petunia Dursley that she hadn't felt since childhood. It wasn't just shock or confusion, it was fear, not of the baby, not even of the future that loomed ahead, but of the man who had left him there. Dumbledore. The name alone still carried weight in her chest, like a stone submerged deep in water. Petunia watched from behind the curtains, her breath shallow, as the tall figure turned away. He didn't knock, he didn't speak. He merely placed the letter next to the infant and vanished into the night. But Petunia knew. She knew it wasn't just a note, it was a message to her. Decades earlier she had written to him, a trembling hand, an innocent plea. "Dear Professor Dumbledore, my sister has been accepted to Hogwarts. I know I am not magical, but is there any way I could be allowed to study there too?" The letter had been long and passionate, full of desperation disguised as politeness. Lily had been her younger sister, but with the arrival of that acceptance letter, Petunia felt as though the hierarchy of their relationship had reversed. Suddenly, Lily was destined for greatness, for a world Petunia would never understand. It hurt more than anything. And so she had tried to cross the barrier, to speak to the gatekeeper himself. He answered, politely, kindly, but firmly, "I am sorry, but Hogwarts is a school for those born with magic." She had torn the letter to pieces, but the words lived on, carved into her bones, not magical, not enough, not welcome. And yet now he stood at her doorstep, bringing magic back into her life, not as a gift, but as a burden. Petunia had never told Vernon about the letter. There were things she didn't dare share. Vernon saw the world in black and white. Magic was madness. Wizards were freaks. That was the script they followed, the one she had written for them. And so when Lily died, Petunia didn't cry in public. She barely spoke of it. She kept her mourning locked away, hidden behind her eyes. And now here was Lily's child, a mirror of everything Petunia tried to bury. With Dumbledore's shadow cast across their front lawn. She read the letter alone in the kitchen. Vernon didn't ask to see it. He didn't want to know. Petunia's hands trembled as she unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was unmistakable. Loops of authority, ink that seemed to glow faintly under the kitchen light. Harry must stay with you. There is a protection upon him, one tied to blood. As long as he can call this house home, he will be safe. Petunia read it again. And again, not a plea, a command, not a choice, a responsibility, and worst of all, a test. Her mind spun back to childhood, the way Lily's eyes lit up when she made flowers bloom with a whisper, the way their parents beamed with pride, and the way Petunia, silent and still, stood behind them all like a forgotten portrait on the wall. She remembered how, on the night Lily first left for Hogwarts, Petunia pretended to be asleep. She couldn't bear to watch her go. She had cried silently into her pillow, every tear a mixture of rage and heartbreak. And when Dumbledore had replied to her letter, oh, how she had hated him then, hated his wisdom, hated his power, hated his certainty that she didn't belong. Now he was back, not in person perhaps, but in presence. His fingerprints were on that letter, his voice was in those words. Petunia folded it again, tighter and tighter, until it became a sharp-edged square that dug into her palm. She placed it in a drawer she rarely opened, a drawer filled with other remnants of the past she pretended not to own. Harry cried that first night. She let him. Vernon snored. Dudley slept soundly. But Petunia sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the soft whimpers from the hallway. She thought of Lily. She thought of the green eyes that now looked up at her from the basket. Eyes identical to her sister's. And she hated Dumbledore for putting that child in her care. For forcing her to confront the one thing she had always feared, the truth. Because Petunia knew Dumbledore had not simply chosen her out of obligation, he knew, he had always known, that moment outside their home wasn't coincidence. His eyes, oh, those piercing blue eyes, they had looked straight into hers. And in that single glance, Petunia felt exposed. Every lie she had told herself, every cruel thing she'd whispered about Lily, every envy-laced insult, he had seen them all, and said nothing. In that silence lay the punishment. Dumbledore didn't have to lecture her, didn't have to remind her of the letter she wrote as a child. The fact that he appeared at her home entrusted her with the boy and left without a word, that was the reminder and the chance. He was offering her the opportunity to do something noble, to be more than she had been, but it terrified her. Years passed. Petunia watched Harry grow, watched the magic in him spark and surge, uncontrolled and uninvited. She punished it when she saw it, locked it away in the cupboard under the stairs, told herself it was for his own good, told herself he needed discipline, but deep down she knew it was fear, the same fear she felt as a child, staring out the window on the day Lily vanished to Hogwarts, the fear of being left behind. When Harry received his own Hogwarts letter, Petunia went pale. She recognized the envelope, the ink, the wax seal. A ghost from the past. Vernon roared. Dudley gawked. But Petunia sat in silence, because she remembered. She remembered her own letter, the one she never received, the one she never deserved. And now it was happening again. History repeating itself, not with her, but through her. When the letters kept arriving, through the mailbox, through the fireplace, even through the chimney, she knew it was him again. Dumbledore. Pulling strings, nudging fate, reminding her that magic cannot be caged, that blood cannot be erased, and that denial has its limits. So when Hagrid finally burst through the door of the hut on the rock and said, "You're a wizard, Harry!" Petunia's heart clenched. "He'll not be going," Vernon had barked. But Petunia, she didn't fight as hard as she once might have. Perhaps she knew it was inevitable. Perhaps she heard, in the wind and in the crashing waves outside, the echo of that long-ago reply, "I am sorry." And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to be sorry anymore. Years later, when Harry asked her, "You knew, didn't you? You knew all along?" Petunia said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would justify the years of silence. Nothing that could explain the pain of being the one left out, the one rejected, the one forgotten by magic. But in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Dumbledore sends a howler to her home, "Remember my last, Petunia?" She doesn't hesitate. Vernon is confused, but Petunia, trembling, says, "The boy will have to stay." Because she understands, because she remembers. The last wasn't just the letter left with Harry, it was the one she had received as a girl, the one she had pretended never existed. Dumbledore's reminder was not just about protection, it was about accountability, about love in its most painful, complicated form, and so, though she never spoke it aloud, Petunia feared Albus Dumbledore not because he was powerful, but because he saw her. He saw through her bitterness. He saw the little girl who had once wished to belong, who had once idolized her sister, who had once written a letter with hope in her heart. He had never forgotten that, and he never let her forget it either. When Petunia closed the door on Harry for the final time before he left for good, she hesitated. In the deleted scene of the film, she almost speaks, almost says what she's carried for years. "You didn't just lose a mother that night in Godric's Hollow. I lost a sister." But she can't. The words stay locked inside, like so much of her life. That is Petunia's secret, her tragedy, her strength. The fear she bore wasn't of magic, it was of being seen for who she really was, of being reminded of what she lost, and of what she was offered but was too afraid to accept. And Albus Dumbledore, with all his wisdom, never condemned her, never chastised her. He simply left a child on her doorstep and gave her a choice, a silent challenge. In his own way, he offered her redemption. Whether she took it or not is a question only Petunia could answer. But in that small act of saying, "The boy will have to stay," she met him halfway. And for Dumbledore, perhaps that was enough. Number 19, Vernon's secret nostalgia. Vernon Dursley's days followed a strict rhythm, governed by predictability and an almost militaristic devotion to normalcy. He commuted to work in a tidy suit, came home to a perfectly trimmed lawn, and made sure that his neighbours had nothing to gossip about, at least not when it came to his household. But there was one quiet secret, unnoticed even by Petunia. Once a week, usually Thursday evenings, he would take a solitary walk to the small park near Privet Drive. From there, he'd wander a bit further down Magnolia Crescent and pause outside a modest bookshop. The place had no magical charm, no flickering lights or odd movements, but it held for Vernon a kind of pull that was both inexplicable and unwelcome. He never mentioned these walks, and certainly not the bookshop. To Petunia he was simply clearing his head or stretching his legs after a long day at Grunnings. But the truth was that one evening, more than a year before the events of Harry Potter's arrival at number 4, Vernon had slipped inside that quiet little shop. It had been raining, only slightly, but he had ducked in to avoid the drizzle. The scent of old paper and polished wood greeted him. No music played. The quiet was absolute. He had intended to browse some business magazines or books on drills to maintain the illusion of practicality, but his eyes fell instead on a slim, leather-bound volume tucked awkwardly between larger titles. The cover was a pale blue, the title embossed in gold, The Silent Wizard. The illustration was simple, a man in an ordinary suit standing among crowds, with a glimmer of light under his hand, unseen by those around him. Vernon hesitated, glanced around, and pulled it out. The author's name was unfamiliar, Lionel Wicks. The book followed the life of a man named Elric, who lived in a grey city not unlike London. Elric worked an office job, lived in a tidy flat, and followed a routine that mirrored Vernon's own. But Elric had a secret. He could perform small feats of magic, not the kind that transformed worlds, but little things. He could calm crying babies, fix broken clocks, make flowers bloom with a gesture. And yet he never used these powers openly. He feared judgment, exile, or worse, being seen as different. The people in his city worshipped sameness. They punished strangeness. Vernon read the book in a single night. He didn't dare bring it inside. He took it home in a brown bag and slipped it into the garage under a pile of old issues of the Times. That night, while Petunia watched television and Dudley shouted from upstairs about broken batteries in his remote, Vernon sat on a folding chair by the water heater, reading by a dim bulb. He turned each page, slowly, reluctantly. The prose wasn't poetic, but it was quiet and direct. It spoke to something inside him that he hadn't known existed. In the final chapter, Elric is confronted by a child who has seen him perform magic. The child doesn't fear him. Instead, the child asks why he hides such a beautiful thing. Elric doesn't answer. He simply walks away, blending into the crowd again, the magic once more sealed within his coat sleeves. The last sentence read, "He feared the light more than the darkness, for the light might reveal too much." Vernon sat in the garage long after the book ended, staring at the words. He didn't understand why they affected him so. It wasn't that he wanted to be Elric. He had no desire for magic. Magic, to him, was chaos, unpredictability, the very antithesis of the world he had built. But something about the idea of hidden strength, of something powerful contained within an ordinary shell, struck a chord. He remembered his own school days. Vernon had never been the fastest or the brightest, but he had learned that if you barked loud enough, if you appeared unshakable, people rarely looked deeper. He had built himself into a fortress of normality, large frame, booming voice, tidy car. It had worked. People respected him, or feared him, or at least left him alone. But the book challenged that. What if there was more beneath the surface of others, of himself? He didn't like the question. He buried the book deeper in the garage and resolved not to visit that shop again. Yet every Thursday his feet brought him near it. And sometimes, when no one was watching, he'd step inside again. He never bought another fantasy book, but he would run his fingers along their spines, eyes catching phrases like hidden realm, ancient gift, or unseen power. One day, a familiar name caught his eye. A book called Daughters of the Wand featured a character named Petunia. The similarity to Petunia startled him. The story was about a woman born into a family of witches who rejected her magical roots in order to marry a man from the ordinary world. Vernon didn't buy the book, but he read the first few pages standing near the exit. The character's bitterness toward her sister, the chosen one, felt eerily familiar. It reminded him of Petunia's rare, sharp comments about Lily. She was always the special one, Petunia had once said, always floating through the house as if the floor wasn't good enough for her feet. Vernon had always dismissed these moments, not wanting to probe, but now he saw them differently. Perhaps Petunia had her own silent wizard buried inside her, one she had strangled long ago. There was a passage in Order of the Phoenix where Petunia shouts, "I was the only one who saw her for what she was. A freak." That moment had always been painted in cruel tones, but Vernon now wondered if it wasn't also born of something deeper, envy, confusion, betrayal. He had heard Petunia crying once, late at night, and she had dismissed it as allergies. He hadn't asked. He never told Petunia about the book, or the others he flipped through in secret. He told himself it was curiosity, not affection. But there were nights he found himself staring at the garage shelf, fingers itching to read The Silent Wizard again. Not because he believed in magic, but because it made the idea of power less frightening. If magic could be gentle, quiet, invisible, then maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the enemy he had imagined. And still he reinforced his walls. When the letter from Hogwarts arrived for Harry, Vernon's immediate reaction was rage. But under it, far under it, was something else. Fear, yes, but also the unwelcome jolt of recognition. This, after all, was Elric's world intruding. The hidden spilling into the visible. Vernon burned the letter not only to protect his household from magic, but to protect himself from the parts of him that had, in a very quiet way, admired it. In Philosopher's Stone, Rowling describes Vernon's horror at the appearance of Hagrid. He was looking at the wand Hagrid had pointed at him as though he'd expected it to explode. But perhaps the wand wasn't the only thing that terrified him. Perhaps it was what it represented, an entire world he'd tried to ignore, deny, and yet secretly contemplated. He hated Albus Dumbledore not only for sending Harry, but because he reminded him of Elric, a man who could smile kindly while hiding immeasurable strength. In the garage, Vernon had once imagined himself meeting Elric. He'd imagined asking him, "Why bother hiding?" And Elric, in Vernon's mind, would shrug and say, "Because they wouldn't understand." That answer haunted Vernon. There was a moment, brief and unnoticed, on the platform at King's Cross. Petunia wiped her eyes quickly as the train pulled away. Vernon grunted something about trains being late, but his eyes followed the disappearing scarlet steam engine a little too long. He didn't see magic. He saw a child, awkward, unsure, stepping into a world where perhaps he wouldn't have to hide. And something in Vernon stirred then. Not joy, not pride, but something quieter. A whisper of that line from the book. He feared the light more than the darkness. He couldn't protect Harry from that world. Not really. But maybe, just maybe, he no longer needed to fear it with the same white-hot hatred. Maybe fear and curiosity had edges that bled into each other. Over the years, the book yellowed in the garage untouched. But Vernon never threw it away. Once, when cleaning before a family barbecue, he came across it again. He paused, then tucked it back under the shelf. Dudley shouted for him from the kitchen, asking for ketchup. Vernon shouted back, but his fingers lingered on the book's cracked spine for a moment longer. The war came and went. The boy lived. Vernon never asked how, but when Harry left for good, Vernon stood on the doorstep for a long time. "Well, that's that," he said. But as he turned, his gaze drifted to the bookshelf in the living room. He had placed a new book there recently, an autobiography of a war hero. But next to it, in quiet rebellion, sat a new purchase from that little shop on Magnolia Crescent, The Boy Who Dreamed of Fire. Petunia never asked where it came from, and Vernon never explained. But once she noticed it open to a passage that read, "Sometimes the most ordinary men carry the wildest storms within them, never letting them show, not even to themselves." She said nothing. But that night she made Vernon a cup of tea without him asking. And he, without knowing why, thanked her softly. Number 20 Dudley and Muggle therapy. There was a quiet part of Privet Drive's history that no one ever spoke about, tucked away between summer afternoons and stiff upper-lip silences. After the Dementors came for Dudley Dursley, in the alley behind Magnolia Crescent, the neighbourhood's symmetry was never quite the same. For Dudley, that night tore a small but permanent hole in the fabric of his carefully constructed world. It was a muggy, grey evening, with air so thick it pressed down on the town like a curse. The Dementors were gone as quickly as they came, but they had left behind something that wouldn't be so easily banished. He changed after that. Slowly, yes, not dramatically. But Aunt Petunia, for all her nerves and neuroses, knew her son. She knew the boy who once laughed at hurting others, now sat at the kitchen table, staring into his cereal like it might bite him back. He stopped smashing things in the backyard, and the boxing gloves were left on the floor of his room, untouched. He mumbled answers instead of barking them. The smug satisfaction that once danced behind his small eyes had dulled. It was Petunia who made the call. She didn't tell Vernon. Vernon would have shouted something about boys being boys and how no Dursley had ever needed that sort of rubbish. But Petunia, for all her flaws, was a mother first. And mothers sometimes do impossible things when the air in the house becomes too heavy for breathing. So she phoned a discreet number written on the back of a parenting magazine she once scoffed at and scheduled a consultation with a private psychotherapist in nearby Little Whinging. The name was Dr. Nicholas Farnham, a man with a calming voice and a small, sun-drenched office filled with succulents and puzzles missing one piece. Dudley hated going. At first, he sat stiffly in the chair, arms crossed like a fortress, replying in grunts. Dr. Farnham didn't push him. The man simply offered him tea, noted what Dudley chose to drink, and once spent an entire session talking about boxing without asking a single personal question. Petunia sat in the waiting room during these early sessions, flipping through magazines without reading them, her eyes darting toward the door every time someone coughed. It was several months before the words started to flow. They came slowly, like oil bubbling to the surface of water. One week, Dudley admitted he didn't sleep well. Another week, he confessed he avoided mirrors. He said the alley gave him nightmares. That when the air got cold and the sky too quiet, his breath still caught in his throat. It wasn't the fear of death that stayed with him. It was the way it made him feel, small, powerless, like something had looked into him and found him wanting. And then, one day, Dr. Farnham asked about guilt. Dudley didn't speak right away. He looked at the tea he hadn't touched. His fingers twitched. Then he said, almost too softly to be heard, "I hate what we did to Harry." The room seemed to still. The therapist didn't respond right away. He only nodded slightly, and Dudley kept going. "I hate how we locked him up, how we treated him. I hate that I laughed, that I let Dad talk about him like that I joined in, that I was cruel because it was easy." Dr. Farnham noted the tension in the boy's voice, not the anger, but the grief, the way memory twisted inside him like a thorn. Dudley wasn't asking for pity. He wasn't trying to escape consequence. He was, for the first time in his life, trying to confront the parts of himself that had gone unchecked for too long. "I think we were monsters," Dudley had said that day. Not like the Dementors, but close enough. The therapist didn't correct him. He didn't absolve him either. Instead, he suggested a small act, a gesture. "Sometimes," he said gently, "you don't need grand speeches. Sometimes what matters is showing that you're different now." Dudley thought about that. He thought about it for weeks. Then came the day when Harry returned to Privet Drive for a brief moment. A quiet day, one of many between wars and goodbyes. He had come to retrieve something. Dumbledore's will had mentioned Grimold Place, and Harry wanted to make sure nothing vital had been left behind. The house was still as sterile as ever. Vernon had gone out for petrol. Petunia was in the kitchen. Dudley stood in the hallway holding a tray. He didn't say anything. He didn't even make eye contact. But he left the tray on the table in the sitting room, a chipped mug of tea and a slice of lemon cake, the kind he remembered Harry once quietly enjoying during a rare, peaceful breakfast years ago. He didn't stay to watch him eat it. He didn't write a note, but Harry saw it. He understood, and that was enough. That small moment never made it into the pages of wizarding history. It was too quiet, too soft for headlines. But in a house once filled with yelling and cupboard doors that locked, it echoed like a hymn. Years later, when Dudley spoke about it again in one of his last sessions with Dr. Farnham, he said that putting that tea on the table was the bravest thing he'd ever done. Not because it was hard, but because it meant accepting that everything before it had been wrong. The therapist nodded again and asked Dudley what he saw in himself now. The answer came easier this time. "I see someone who's trying." Petunia never told Vernon about the therapy. She never needed to. Vernon noticed the changes. Dudley became less reactive, more thoughtful. He stopped mocking news presenters on TV. He gave up boxing altogether and took up sketching, quiet lines and shadows drawn with patient hands. Vernon once found a notebook of portraits, one of which looked unmistakably like Harry from behind, walking away down a road bordered with trees. He didn't comment on it. He didn't have the words. Petunia kept her own silent watch. Sometimes she paused in the hallway, watching her son read with his door ajar, remembering the times she'd heard nothing but video games and slamming drawers. There was a softness to him now. It made her proud and ashamed at the same time. Proud because he was trying, ashamed because it meant everything before had been something he needed healing from. They never talked openly about Harry. The name remained heavy in the air, a relic of a past too fragile for direct touch. But sometimes, when the house was quiet, Petunia would look at the empty cupboard under the stairs and wonder what might have happened if she'd acted sooner. If she'd picked up the phone not for her son, but for the boy in the cupboard. Harry, for his part, never brought it up again either. He noticed the effort. He didn't ignore it, but he let it be. In Deathly Hallows, Rolling writes, Dudley had reached out his hand and shaken Harry's. Harry had been so shocked he had missed the opportunity to take it. That moment of extended fingers and missed understanding had more weight than any apology, but in truth that handshake had been preceded by the cup of tea, by the lemon cake, by the words left unspoken but felt all the same. Dr. Farnham eventually retired. Dudley stopped attending sessions in his late teens, but wrote the man a letter some years later. He thanked him for teaching him that not all monsters had fangs, and that redemption didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, often unnoticed. He told him about the community college courses he was taking, about the volunteer work at a centre for youth mentorship, about how he once interrupted a boy in the park, bullying someone smaller, and didn't just tell him to stop. He sat down with both boys and told them a story. He didn't use Harry's name, but he told them about a kid who lived in a cupboard and didn't have anyone until he had everything, and how people only started realizing they were wrong when they saw him smile after everything. That story, like many others, drifted out into the world with no wand to propel it, no owl to carry it, just memory and breath and tea cooling on a table. In the end, Dudley Dursley never became a hero of the wizarding world, but in a way that mattered only to him and to the quiet places Harry once avoided. He became someone else entirely. He became kind. He became aware. He became the sort of person who, when he saw someone lost in fear, would no longer mock them, but offer them something warm to hold. And in the legacy of Privet Drive, that is perhaps the most powerful kind of magic there is. Number 21. The Unfortunate Trip to Scotland. Of all the curious footnotes in the story of the Dursleys, none is as quietly pivotal as the misfortunate trip Vernon and Petunia took to the Scottish Highlands, years before their son Dudley was born. It was Petunia's idea entirely, a nostalgic longing rooted in her childhood, back when she and her younger sister Lily had not yet become strangers. As children, the Evans girls had once vacationed near the rugged cliffs and moody valleys of Scotland. Petunia remembered lochs that shimmered like glass and hilltops where the wind seemed to whisper secrets. But most of all, she remembered Lily's face alight with wonder, chasing butterflies that sparkled a bit too brightly, birds that responded a little too intelligently to her giggles. Petunia told Vernon none of that. She simply insisted that a quiet, rural trip to the Highlands would be restorative, civilized, and romantic. Vernon, still eager to please his new wife, grudgingly agreed. Their chosen destination was a modest guest house nestled in a valley flanked by two steep hills and crowned by the crumbling ruins of an ancient stone keep. The land around it stretched wild and green, peppered with sheep and hidden trails. The castle, according to their hostess, was once the seat of a minor Scottish lord, long since forgotten. It had no historical plaque, no visitors' centre, nothing to attract tourists, just the way Vernon liked it. For a man who prided himself on good sense, order, and neat hedges, Vernon tolerated nature only when it was trimmed into submission, and yet he was there, tramping. Through damp heather, in an expensive overcoat, clutching a thermos of weak tea. The weather turned quickly on their first evening, as it often does in that part of the world. Mist settled in like an unwelcome guest, turning the landscape to a watercolour blur. The distant silhouette of the ruined castle seemed to shift and stretch when you looked at it too long. That night, as Vernon tried to read a car magazine in their room, he became increasingly irritated by strange sounds drifting in through the thin glass window. There were soft pops like distant fireworks, and once a noise like a whip cracking across the sky. When he peered out, he saw nothing, just fog and shadow. Petunia dismissed his complaints as local wildlife. "It's Scotland," she muttered, rolling over in bed. But Vernon had a sharp instinct for what was not quite normal, and this mist held something other. In the pale morning light, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep, he stood outside with a teacup in hand, hoping the fresh air might ground him. That's when he saw the man. The figure emerged from the tree line beyond the castle ruins, tall and impossibly broad, draped in a weather-beaten cloak the colour of midnight. A tangled beard covered most of his face, and a belt thick as a python cinched a tattered coat that fell to his knees. But it wasn't the man that held Vernon's gaze. It was the creature he led behind him on a chain. Vernon could never quite describe it later, not to Petunia. Not even to himself. It shimmered faintly as if its fur or feathers were woven from light. Its eyes glowed a deep amber, and it moved with the cautious grace of something far too clever for its own good. Vernon dropped his teacup. The man didn't glance his way. He simply guided the creature past the ruins and vanished back into the woods. Vernon didn't wait. Within 10 minutes, their bags were packed. The room key returned with a gruff excuse about urgent business, and the car pointed south with shaking hands on the wheel. Petunia was furious. She had barely finished her breakfast and had planned a stroll around the nearby loch. Vernon muttered only one sentence on the entire drive back to Surrey, but he said it 3 times. "We are never going back there." What Vernon Dursley saw that morning may never be fully known. It was not a dragon too small, not a hippogriff too luminous. Some believe, after comparing scattered reports, that it was a moon calf, a creature known to dance under full moons and used in magical farming rituals. Others suggest it was an augury, misidentified due to the heavy fog. But for Vernon, none of that mattered. What he saw confirmed every deeply buried suspicion he'd nursed since meeting Petunia's estranged sister, that magic was not only real, but far too close. From that moment onward, Vernon adopted a new rule for life: avoid the unknown. Magic, he declared in the privacy of his mind, was a threat to normalcy, to dignity, to property taxes and barbecue grills and the postal service. It was an invasive species of chaos. He buried the memory of that Scottish morning beneath layers of denial, but its roots never let go. It is no coincidence that in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Vernon's unravelling begins with owls behaving oddly and letters arriving in impossible ways. "No post on Sundays," he growled. "No damn letters today." And yet they came. To a man who once saw a luminous beast led by a man in robes, every strange postmark was a warning, every owl a herald. He may not have told Petunia, but she saw the fear in his eyes. Years later, when Hagrid appeared again, this time smashing through the door of a lonely hut in the sea, It was the final confirmation. Vernon recognized the man's bulk, the wild hair, and the impossible coat. He said nothing, but his skin went pale. When Hagrid turned his gaze toward him, Vernon looked away. He couldn't meet the eyes of the man who had once walked out of the mist with something ancient on a leash. Petunia, for her part, remembered that trip only in fragments. She never connected it to magic, though in her heart she may have wondered. The loch had shimmered too strangely, the fog had felt too thick. She told herself that if magic had been there, she hadn't seen it. That was enough. She preferred Vernon's version of reality, bland, predictable, paved with shopping centres and Sunday roasts. But for Vernon, that trip was the axis on which his worldview pivoted. His hatred of magic was not born in abstract bigotry, it was born in panic. To him, magic was not whimsical or wondrous, it was something that stared back at him through amber eyes and left him feeling small. In the presence of that creature, Vernon had been reminded of how little he understood the world, and he hated that. It is worth noting that after this trip, Vernon refused all future suggestions for rural holidays. He scoffed at national parks, he sneered at cottages, he declared camping un-British. When Dudley was born, he planned only sterile seaside resorts and amusement parks with maps and tidy queues. The further from those places, the better, he'd mutter any time someone mentioned Scotland, or even Yorkshire. It became a kind of mantra. This story never made its way into the official narrative of the boy who lived, but perhaps it should have. It colours Vernon's overreactions in a new light. Why, after all, did he take such extremes to prevent Harry from getting his Hogwarts letter? Why did he drive his family across the country to escape an envelope? Because he had already seen what magic looked like when it wanted to hide, and knew it was perfectly capable of finding you anyway. Even his refusal to allow Harry to utter words like Hogwarts or wand takes on a more desperate note when we recall that one time he heard whispers in the fog and saw impossible light flickering in the trees. In the Chamber of Secrets, when the Dursleys lock Harry in his room and install bars on his window, Vernon explains that it's for your own good. On the surface, it's a ridiculous claim, but delve deeper and you see a man trying to control the uncontrollable, trying to wall out the forest. Vernon Dursley was not a brave man, but he was not a fool either. He may not have understood the magical world, but he felt its weight. He saw that it operated by rules that mocked everything he held dear: predictability, propriety, logic. What scared him most wasn't that magic existed, but that it existed without apology. There is one final detail worth noting. The guest house where they stayed that weekend, according to Ministry of Magic records, stood adjacent to a known apparition checkpoint used by members of the Order of the Phoenix during the First Wizarding War. The ruins had once hidden a temporary ward for wounded magical creatures and sympathizers. The bearded man Vernon glimpsed might not have been Hagrid, but someone else entirely, perhaps a caretaker or a magizoologist. Passing through, the creature might have been injured, being led to shelter. Vernon, in his ignorance, had stumbled across a war in shadows, and that in the end is the most ironic tragedy of Vernon Dursley's life. He had seen the truth. He had been offered a brief, terrifying glimpse behind the curtain, and instead of asking questions, instead of wondering, he built walls. He told himself that the world was flat and safe and beige, and did everything he could to ensure that his son Dudley would inherit the same illusion. But the forest never forgets, the fog never really lifts. Somewhere in the Highlands, a ruined castle still stands. And if you walk through the right glen at dawn, you might see glowing footprints in the dew, or hear the echo of hooves that never belonged to any horse. Vernon Dursley would never return, but for a single, shivering moment he had seen what lay beyond the hedge, and he never recovered. Number 22. The Hidden Childhood Photos. There was a cupboard in the Dursleys' house at number 4, Privet Drive, that no one ever spoke about. Tucked away above the hallway coat closet, too high for casual inspection, and too insignificant for regular cleaning, it held what Petunia Dursley had sworn never to acknowledge. And yet there it was, sealed in a worn cardboard box, lined with yellowing tissue paper and filled with photographs that smelled of dust and wildflowers. It was the one piece of her past that had not been ruthlessly pruned away. The one thing she could never bring herself to burn. The photos were of 2 girls, Lily and Petunia Evans, before Hogwarts, before the letters, before magic ripped a rift between them that would never fully close. In one picture, Lily stood in the snow, her red hair tangled and wet, holding a crooked child-made snowman, while Petunia adjusted a mismatched scarf around its neck. In another, the 2 sisters sat cross-legged under the Christmas tree, paper crowns on their heads, chocolate smeared on their cheeks, and laughter frozen in glossy permanence. There were no spells in these photos, no owls or wands, only a kind of joy so ordinary that it felt magical. It was this ordinariness that Petunia could not discard, because those were the years when she wasn't the odd one out. Years later, when Harry Potter found that box, quite by accident, while washing windows and shifting boxes, he was struck by the sight of his mother in motionless joy. Until that moment, his only image of Lily had been through the haze of stories. Noble sacrifice, tragic love, a flash of green light. But here was Lily laughing barefoot in a garden, tossing water from a hose as Petunia shrieked beside her. That image, more than any tale Dumbledore could tell, pierced Harry's heart, because it wasn't the legend, it was the girl. Petunia had snatched the album from his hands as though it burned her fingers. She hadn't said a word, only tucked it under her arm and walked off stiffly, her lips pressed into a line so tight it seemed carved in stone. Harry didn't ask again, but he remembered. He remembered every detail of those frozen moments. The way Lily's eyes shone, the way she leaned into her sister with a trust that made his chest ache. And he wondered what kind of silence had made Petunia preserve them in secret. She had once said, in a voice like vinegar, "My sister got herself blown up, and we got landed with you." But those photos told a different story. They spoke of love and of loss that wasn't tidy or bitter, not entirely. They whispered of memories too soft to destroy. Petunia had tried in every way to excise Lily from her world. She hadn't spoken her name for years. She had insisted that Vernon refer to her only as that woman. She had told Dudley that his aunt had run off with a cult. But alone with the blinds drawn and Vernon's snores echoing down the hall, Petunia sometimes opened that album and traced the edges of the photos with a trembling finger. She never forgave Lily for being chosen, not really. Petunia had written to Dumbledore once, a pleading letter that began with, "Dear Sir," and ended with the sentence, "I want to be special too." He had responded kindly, if briefly, but he had said no. And when Lily left for Hogwarts that September, Petunia had smiled at the train station only for the sake of their parents. Inside, she felt the first sting of the exclusion that would haunt her forever. But none of that was in the photos. In them, Lily was still her sister, and Petunia was still the most important person in Lily's world. That was what the photos preserved, not the truth of what followed, but the truth of what was once. In those images, they were equals, and love was simple. There was one photo that Petunia stared at the most. It had been taken by their mother in late spring, in the back garden of their home in Cokeworth. Lily was picking daisies. Petunia sat beside her, reading Little Women, her hair pulled back with a blue ribbon. The sun was gentle, Lily's nose had freckles. There was a peace in that picture that made it unbearable and essential all at once. She had nearly torn it once, after Lily's death. When Dumbledore had left that cursed baby on her doorstep, she had opened the box with the intention to rid herself of it all. But when her fingers brushed the edge of that photo, she froze, and she put it all back. It was not kindness that drove her to keep it, nor nostalgia. It was something rawer, something like guilt. Because no matter how many times she had said she hated magic, there had been a time when she didn't, a time when she had looked at Lily in awe, not resentment. And sometimes, in dreams, she still saw her sister holding out her hand, inviting her to come see something sparkling at the edge of the woods. That was a dream Petunia never spoke of, not even to herself. The album contained only photographs before Hogwarts. After that, there had been no more snapshots. Their father had bought a camera that winter, but the sisters had stopped posing together. The divide had grown so fast, so brutally, that even their mother stopped suggesting pictures. Lily had grown into her magic. Petunia had grown into her silence. She kept the album even after her parents died. She'd packed it quietly while Vernon waited in the car, tapping the steering wheel. When she moved to Surrey, she had wrapped it in a tea towel and buried it in the top cupboard, behind winter coats and tax forms. And once a year, usually when Dudley was away at camp and Vernon was attending a conference, she would climb the stepladder and bring it down. She would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of Earl Grey and flip through the pages slowly, sometimes pausing on a photo long enough to cry. Petunia never spoke of Lily in anything but bitter tones, but those photos betrayed her. They were worn at the edges, as if handled too often. Some had faint fingerprints where Lily's face had been touched again and again. One had a faint stain, as if a teardrop had once fallen and been hurriedly wiped away. These were not the marks of indifference. They were the remnants of mourning. The memory of their final argument before Hogwarts haunted Petunia. She had screamed something cruel, something she could never take back. Lily had stared at her, eyes wide, before turning away, and that had been the last time they had spoken as children. Every time Petunia opened that album, she returned to that moment, not to punish herself, but to remember the time before she had said the thing that broke them. Years later, when Harry returned from Hogwarts after his first year, he noticed a change in her. Not much, but enough. She didn't flinch when he said Lily's name. She didn't snap when he mentioned Hogwarts. And once, as he was reaching for a cup in the cupboard, he noticed the box had been moved. Not far, just shifted to the side. But it was a sign. She had looked at it recently. Petunia would never admit it, but part of her was grateful for the few times Harry spoke of Lily without anger or sadness. When he mentioned that she had been good at charms, or that Professor McGonagall had once called her the most brilliant student she ever taught, Petunia would purse her lips, but her eyes would flicker. It was a strange comfort, hearing that Lily had been more than a tragedy. Dudley never knew about the album. Vernon wouldn't have understood. It was Petunia's secret, and she guarded it like a relic, because in that album was proof that once, just once, she had known what it was to be loved without comparison. In the Order of the Phoenix, when Dumbledore reminded her, "You did not just sit by, you protected him," he wasn't just speaking of her promise. He was acknowledging that somewhere, deep beneath her bitterness, there was still love. Not for Harry, perhaps, but for the sister she had lost, for the child she had once shared her secrets with, the girl with red hair and dancing feet. Harry would never see the album again, not after that one glimpse, but he remembered the image of Lily holding Petunia's hand and laughing so freely that even the paper seemed to tremble with it. It was that photo he thought of years later, when he placed a portrait of Lily in his home, not the regal one that looked like a hero, but one where she sat under a tree, smiling at someone just outside the frame. Someone like a sister. Petunia never told anyone why she kept the photographs. But perhaps that wasn't necessary. The fact that she did was enough. Enough to suggest that even the hardest hearts carry echoes. that love, once given, cannot be entirely erased. And in that forgotten cupboard, in a neat suburban house where magic was a dirty word, there lived a kind of magic that had nothing to do with wands or spells. It was the magic of memory, of things left unsaid, and of the quiet ways people carry grief. Even in silence, Petunia remembered, number 23, what happened to number 4 Privet Drive. Of all the houses in Little Whinging, number 4 Privet Drive was the most ordinary. That, at least, is what everyone believed, but in truth it was a house that once held an extraordinary secret. After Harry Potter left it for the final time in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, never to return, the house stood silent. The Dursleys disappeared as suddenly as they had lived, without farewells, without forwarding addresses. Petunia left. Behind her pristine kitchen, Vernon left behind a battered armchair, and Dudley, who had once feared the owl-post, as though it were plague, left a single trainer under his bed. No one came to collect their things, no one claimed ownership. The house waited, abandoned, as if holding its breath. For a while, local real estate agents tried to sell the house. But there was something off about it, something that unsettled prospective buyers. "There's just a feeling," one agent told the Surrey Property Times, as though someone's watching from upstairs. The home was well maintained. The front bushes were still trimmed in Vernon's square obsessive style. The rosebush Petunia had planted in 1982, just after Harry's arrival, still clung to life. Yet buyers declined, often without stepping. Inside, the rumour on Privet Drive was simple. The house was haunted. Most of the neighbours refused to talk about what had happened there. Mrs. Number 6 had once tried to peek into the Dursleys' window shortly after they'd left, but said she heard a sharp, humming noise like a beehive, but it stopped as soon as I looked in. She never went near it again. The McKinley family, who moved in briefly in 2003, lasted only 6 weeks. They cited structural issues and left in the middle of the night. A week later, they mailed back the keys anonymously with no explanation. What the neighbours didn't know was that number 4 had once been the site of ancient magic. As Dumbledore explained in Half-Blood Prince, Harry was protected by the magic of blood, the bond between Lily and her sister. As long as he called Petunia's house home, no one could touch him. That protective enchantment had long since faded, but it had left a residue, not of light, but of memory, and in memory magic sometimes lingers longer than it should. Years passed. A boy named Nathan Elsie and his mother moved into the house in 2007. Nathan was 10. He had no idea about the house's past. His mother, a practical woman named Margaret, had bought the house cheap, believing the rumours to be nonsense. Nathan, however, felt the strangeness at once. He avoided the cupboard under the stairs instinctively. He said the air inside it was too quiet. His bedroom, the smallest room upstairs, overlooked the street, but Nathan often found himself staring instead at the door across the landing, the one that had once been Harry Potter's. One evening, Nathan was lying on the floor of the hallway upstairs playing with marbles. One marble rolled toward the far wall. When he picked it up, he noticed a slight creaking under the carpet. He pressed down. It gave slightly. Curiosity overcame him. He fetched a screwdriver and pulled up a loose floorboard. What he found underneath would puzzle him for years. Inside was a small cloth pouch. Inside the pouch, one faded button, the kind a child might lose in the grass. A crumpled paper note with the words, "Not real," says Vernon, "but I saw her fly," and wrapped in an old tissue, a dry petal of a lily flower. It had browned with age, but its edges were still delicate, like paper. Nathan showed his mother, who dismissed it as junk. He didn't. Nathan kept the pouch under his bed. He didn't know what it meant. He only knew it felt important. He later told his best friend in secondary school that he used to hear whispers in the hallway at night. Sometimes, just as he was falling asleep, the faint creak of stairs. Other times the smell of cinnamon and lilies would drift into his room, though they had neither in the house. Like ghosts of memories, he once wrote in his journal. When he turned 15, Nathan began to research the house. He found a copy of the Daily Prophet wedged into the back of an old bookshelf. That was the beginning. He started writing to anyone who might know more. Most people ignored him. But in 2012, he received a reply from an old man named Daedalus Diggle. The letter was brief. What you found belongs to a boy whose life changed the world. Do not discard it. That was all. Nathan began to read everything he could about the boy who lived. The public records were fragmented, mostly speculation. The Muggle world knew little, but there were enough details. One blurry photograph of a boy with black hair standing near a train station, an old school directory from St. Brutus's secure centre for incurably criminal boys that curiously had no record of a Harry Potter ever attending. And then he found it, an obscure passage from Rita Skeeter's banned biography, The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore, referencing the magically shielded residence in a Dursley household. From then on, Nathan became obsessed with the name Potter. He didn't tell his mother, but he started dreaming of owls tapping on windows. Once, he woke to find a single feather on his windowsill. He kept the lily petal pressed in a book called British Magical History, The Modern Age, filed under a chapter about Voldemort's downfall. Sometimes he would open the page just to stare at it. It didn't make sense, and yet it did. In 2015, Nathan visited a magical archive in Edinburgh disguised as a tourist centre. There, under the guidance of a squinting old volunteer named Maris Pennyweather, he was shown an artifact index. Entry 94B, petal recovered from Privet Drive residence, presumed to be of Lily Potter origin, magic imprint, residual, status, unstable. He asked to see it, but the page was marked removed for internal inquiry. What remained on Privet Drive was not just memory. Some claimed it was a trace of ancient protection, like dried ink on old parchment. Others whispered that it was guilt. Petunia had never reconciled her choices. She left in a hurry, taking little. Her last act was to lock Harry's room from the outside, one final futile attempt to control the past. But she left the rose bush. And the rose bush, some say, still blooms in November. Harry never returned. He didn't need to, but magic, even when no longer active, often carves itself into the bones of places, and children, in their innocence, notice the echoes. Nathan once told his teacher that he didn't believe in ghosts. Only in places where the air remembers, he said. He didn't elaborate. But that year he wrote a short story for class about a boy who lived in a house where light flickered when no electricity flowed, and who found a flower petal that hummed faintly in his palm. His teacher gave him an A and wrote, "What an imagination." Years later, Nathan would move away. But before he left, he buried the pouch beneath the rosebush. "It belongs here," he said aloud, to no one. The bush trembled once, though the air was still. He never told anyone exactly what he had seen that final night in the hallway. Only that the light from the room across the landing glowed faint gold, though the bulb was long removed. The neighbours say the house has been empty again for years. Some say it's for sale, some say it's not. One teenage girl tried to film a ghost hunting video there in 2019, but her camera refused to turn on. She said it felt like something didn't want to be watched. Her video was never uploaded. She never returned. Even now, a child walking by the house might glance up and see that the curtain in the smallest bedroom is slightly askew, or that the light behind it flickers. Adults dismiss it, but children pause. And perhaps one day another will press their hand to the floorboard and feel the wood tremble. Some say the lily petal was never real. Others say it was a manifestation, an echo left by a mother's final sacrifice, a symbol of the spell that protected her son. "You are protected," Dumbledore had told Harry, "by her blood. And though the spell is gone, Perhaps some fragment remained, hidden not in wards or shields, but in something softer. A whisper, a petal. The house at number 4 does not speak, but it holds memories, not just of Harry's confinement and fear, but of love, too. Buried under Petunia's denial and Vernon's rage was a story of survival. One child unloved, another child who died for him, a cupboard, a button, a petal, the elements of a life shaped by invisible forces, and perhaps, just perhaps, the next child to live there will feel it too. The sense that somewhere in the quiet a boy once stood by the window, longing for the world to change. Number 24, the unknown grandmother, a witch in the family. Petunia Dursley always claimed, with a stiff upper lip and a tone of self-righteous pride, that there had never been anything abnormal in her family. Her famous sneer, reserved for anyone who so much as mentioned magic, was reinforced by this firm belief, or rather, this firm pretense. Because buried beneath the carefully curated facade of respectability and order, behind the lace curtains of a tidy suburban home in Cokeworth, lay a story that had never been told in the open. The mystery of Agatha Winston, Petunia's maternal grandmother, a woman whom time had tried to forget, but whose shadow stretched quietly across the years. Agatha Winston was not a name you would find in the magical registries. She was never formally educated at Hogwarts, nor did she work at the Ministry of Magic. She lived quietly in the same small town as the Evans family, just a few streets away from Spinner's End. The locals whispered her name in hushed tones, not out of fear, but out of confused reverence. She had a knack, they said, for finding what was lost. Not through logic or effort, but in strange ways, ways that unnerved those who didn't understand. When a wedding ring slipped down a sink and vanished, Agatha found it in the soil beneath a rose bush days later. When a toddler wandered off from the market, it was Agatha who led the search party directly to the child, saying she had followed the pull of the wind. Her house was filled with peculiar objects, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, glass jars filled with murky roots and shimmering dusts, a row of ancient books written in Latin and Gaelic, and a peculiar scent of rain and lavender that lingered even on the hottest summer days. Those who visited often left with a cure for their ailments, potions for sleep, for love, for luck. Of course, no one called them potions. They were remedies or old-fashioned cures, but some claimed that Agatha could calm a fever with a chant, or that she could make a person dream of the one who missed them. No one could explain these things, and few tried. Cokeworth was not a town fond of questions. Petunia remembered her only in flickers, a firm grip on her shoulder, the texture of a woolen shawl, the murmur of something not quite English under the breath. But Lily remembered her with a radiant affection. Granny Aggie, she had once called her in a letter discovered years later, folded between pages of an old diary. In that letter, Lily described a day spent in Agatha's garden. She showed me a bird that sings only to people it likes, the child wrote in careful cursive. It sat on my hand and looked right at me. Lily was 7. A single photograph in the Evans family album is all that remains to the public eye. A tall, hawk-nosed woman in what appears to be a dark cloak, not just a shawl, but a full-length black mantle. Around her neck, a circular pendant with a carved symbol that resembled the ancient rune Iwaz associated with protection and initiation. The photograph was never shown willingly. Petunia, according to Lily's diary, once tore the picture from the album and threw it in the bin, only for their mother to retrieve and tuck it away again. Agatha had died when the girls were young. Petunia was 5. Lily was only 3. But something in the family shifted after Agatha's death. That much is certain. Lily began to display unusual signs, the floating petals, the talking daffodils, the strange way she could make bruises fade from her elbows overnight. Their parents, initially concerned, grew quietly fascinated. They encouraged Lily's oddities, Mrs. Evans began visiting her late mother's herb cupboard, mixing teas and applying homemade ointments with a confidence that startled even herself. Mr. Evans, though a man of numbers and clocks, would sit and listen to Lily's tales of what the wind told her. Petunia, always so eager to stand straight and proper, could not abide it. It wasn't simply jealousy, it was fear. She saw in her sister what she had feared in Agatha, the uncanny, the inexplicable, the wrong. While Lily bloomed under the attention, Petunia withdrew. She started scrubbing her shoes until they shone, ironing her clothes with furious precision, and correcting her sister's grammar with cold authority. She sought order. Lily embodied chaos. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Vernon Dursley thinks to himself that Petunia often said that her sister got herself blown up, a crude summary of the story Petunia told herself to maintain control over the chaos of her family history. But when Dumbledore later arrives at Privet Drive with Harry in a basket, he refers in his letter to Petunia's sister as someone who died to save her son. It's telling that Petunia keeps the letter for years. Buried in the attic of the Evans household, uncovered after the war by an archivist at the Cokeworth Historical Society, was a trunk. Inside were remnants of Agatha's life, hand-bound books filled with herbal symbols and lunar calendars, a birch wand, snapped, and a diary filled with passages that straddled the line between spellcraft and poetry. One entry, dated June 1943, read, "My daughter's belly quickens. I feel the pulse of another light stirring. The river will split into two streams, one dark with questions, one bright with thunder." The daughter was Evelyn Evans, Petunia's mother. There is no formal record of Agatha Winston ever attending a magical institution. Some have speculated that she was a wild witch, a term used for those who practice instinctive ancestral magic without training. The ministry, particularly in the early 20th century, turned a blind eye to such women so long as they stayed quiet. It is also possible that she had ties to older magical lineages in Ireland or Scotland, where the old ways still clung to the soil. But nothing is confirmed. Even the symbol on her pendant, while recognized by certain rune masters, has no official documentation in magical education. Why then would Petunia deny her so vigorously? Perhaps because Petunia's entire identity hinged upon being normal, being accepted. In a world that punished eccentricity, she could not risk being linked to someone who talked to the wind. And yet she could never completely detach herself. Her obsessive neatness, her hypervigilance, her intolerance of unpredictability, they all reek of someone trying to outpace a legacy. She wasn't just afraid of Lily's powers, she was afraid of her own blood. There's one peculiar story told by Arabella Figg, squib neighbour of the Dursleys and trusted observer for Dumbledore. In an offhand remark overheard at Order headquarters, she once mentioned that when she was a girl, she met an old woman who had the eyes of a seer but never named herself one. She described the woman as wearing boots too muddy for a town street and speaking to her cat as though it answered. The year was 1951. Arabella was 9. The woman's name she couldn't remember, but the pendant she wore matched the one in Agatha's photograph. Years later, Petunia would reject magic with such vehemence that she even scolded her own son for saying please when asking for something unusual. But during a particularly tense dinner, she once paused mid-sentence, her eyes locked on Dudley's hand as he reached for a dish, and a bowl moved ever so slightly, just before he touched it. Vernon hadn't noticed. Petunia had. She blinked, then said nothing, but her grip on the serving spoon turned white with pressure. If Agatha Winston truly had magical blood, and if she passed it on to her daughter Evelyn, then both Petunia and Lily inherited it. In Lily it blossomed fully. In Petunia it lay dormant, suffocated by shame and self-denial. This would make Harry not the first magical child in the family, but the third generation of a legacy hidden behind suburban brick walls and pleated skirts. There's a moment in Deathly Hallows, one that most readers overlook. in which Petunia opens her mouth to say something to Harry as she leaves the house forever. She falters. The moment slips by, unexplained. But what if she had wanted to tell him? About Agatha, about the things she knew and buried, about the day she opened her eyes during a thunderstorm and swore she saw a glowing shape in the mirror behind her. She said nothing because she was too far gone into the persona she had built. But the memory, perhaps, haunted her. The tragedy of Petunia Dursley is not that she was merely cruel or small-minded, it's that she was afraid of herself. Her rejection of magic was not just prejudice, it was self-preservation. She had inherited a spark she dared not examine. And when that spark passed to her nephew, she punished it as though she were punishing a part of herself. But in truth, the magic was never only Lily's. It had roots deeper than either sister knew, roots tangled with the wild whispers of Agatha Winston, the woman who spoke to the wind. Number 25. Lily's unread letter. Of all the secrets buried under the mundane roof of Number 4, Privet Drive, none was quieter or more forgotten than a single unopened letter. Not a letter from Gringotts or Hogwarts, not even a howler or a muggle bill. It was a simple envelope with slightly worn edges, the ink faded just slightly from time and air. The handwriting was unmistakably Lily Evans's, rounded, elegant, carefully shaped, as if she had placed each letter with the tender care only a mother or a sister could muster. It bore no seal, no sigils, no enchantments, just Lily's handwriting and Petunia Dursley's name. In the days before Voldemort shattered the quiet lives of the Potters, Lily sat at the kitchen table in Godric's Hollow. Her wand lay unused beside her teacup. The house hummed with protective enchantments cast by Dumbledore himself, but inside the home there was only the crackle of a nearby fireplace and the soft babble of her 1-year-old son, Harry. The war outside was reaching its fevered pitch, and Lily felt the breath of fate upon her neck. She had seen too many disappear, too many lives fractured. She feared what might come. But in that rare moment of quiet, she wrote. The letter wasn't long. It had no mention of Horcruxes or the prophecy or Voldemort. It didn't beg Petunia for forgiveness. It simply said, "I miss you. I want Harry to know his aunt. Come, just for a day. Only you and I like it used to be." It was not written with magic. She could have enchanted it, ensured it reached its destination in seconds, bypassed any interference. But she didn't. She sent it the old way with a trusted owl and a hope too fragile to spell out. The owl never arrived in time. There are magical theories, unproven and undocumented, about how strong dark magic can disturb communication between realms. The protective charms around the Potter home created a tangle of power, and somewhere in that ether the owl was lost for days. By the time it reached Little Whinging, Lily and James were already dead. The Dark Lord had been vanquished, and Harry Potter was the boy who lived. Petunia found the envelope on her doormat the morning after her world changed. Dumbledore had left Harry on her doorstep in the dead of night, along with a second letter, his own. She read the letter from Dumbledore, but the one from Lily. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. She stared at the name, her name, but she did not open it. She placed it, unread, into a drawer and shut it away. There are those who believe that Petunia Dursley hated magic. They are not wrong, but they often miss the quiet tragedy of her life, of being the sister who was not chosen, the one who waited for an owl that never came, who once dreamed of belonging and instead was left behind. Lily's letter arrived too late to heal anything, and perhaps to Petunia that made it unbearable. The grief was too raw, the guilt too sharp. Years passed. The letter moved from the drawer to a box, from a box to the attic. It was tucked away among old school books, broken Christmas ornaments, and the hospital wristband from when Dudley was born. It sat beneath dust and years of silence. Vernon never asked about it. Dudley never knew. But Petunia remembered. Every time she walked past the attic stairs, she remembered. Harry never knew the letter existed. He never saw it during his time on Privet Drive. It was not among the things he was allowed to touch. But once, years later, after the war had ended and Voldemort was gone for good, he returned to the house with a different kind of curiosity. It was long abandoned, boarded up. The neighborhood had changed. Dudley had moved away. Petunia had passed quietly in a hospital. Bed, surrounded by nurses who knew nothing about witches or Dark Lords. In the attic, Harry found the box. He didn't recognize the handwriting at first. It was only when he turned the envelope over in his hands that something stirred. Some forgotten memory, perhaps of Lily's voice or the scent of her hair. His fingers hovered above the flap, but even then he didn't open it. He closed the box and took it with him. Some doors are not meant to be opened. Lily had hoped for reconciliation. That much was clear. Her words were simple, without pretense or agenda. She didn't speak of magic or battles or Voldemort. She wrote as a sister, as a mother, as someone who missed her family and wanted her son to know it. Perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all, that Petunia, who had always wanted to be part of Lily's world, rejected its last olive branch. There is a photograph, half-burned, that once sat in Lily's drawer. It showed two girls in a field, laughing, sun in their hair, arms flung around each other. One had red curls, the other wore a sunflower dress. Severus Snape once saw them like this, and later, when he spoke to Dumbledore of Lily's life, he said, "She was kind, even when she had no reason to be." That kindness lived in the letter. It was an offering. J.K. Rowling never confirmed the full contents of the letter, but in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows a brief mention is made. Harry finds a letter from his mother to Sirius, dated shortly before her death. In it she says, "I'm enclosing a picture of Harry and I hope he looks more like James now, because otherwise Sirius might think he's been mixed up at birth." She writes with warmth, lightness, the tone of someone not yet broken by fear. Perhaps the letter to Petunia had a similar note. Perhaps Lily still believed in something better, even then. Petunia's decision not to open the letter can be read 100 ways, as cowardice, as denial, as bitterness. But there is something deeply human in her silence. Some people cannot confront their grief, some cannot reopen old wounds, and some carry shame so long it becomes a second skin. For Petunia, that letter may have been too heavy to bear. The tragedy of Lily and Petunia is not that they were enemies, it's that they loved each other once and never found a way back. In a different world, Petunia might have been Harry's second mother, not his jailer. She might have taught him about his mother from the heart, not from resentment. But the path between them was severed too early, and the letter that might have bridged it came too late. Magic cannot undo time. It cannot change what is lost. The most powerful spell in the world cannot make someone open an envelope they've locked away in fear. That is perhaps the true heartbreak of the story. That even with all the magic in the world, the one thing Lily wanted, for her sister to hold her son and remember love, was the one thing that never happened. Harry would go on to have children of his own. He would tell them about their grandmother, her bravery, her smile. He would speak of Petunia, only briefly. She did what she could, he might say, the way people speak of family they never quite understood. But he never told them about the letter. That remained between the sisters. And somewhere, perhaps in the archives of Hogwarts, or in a private room in the home of an old Auror, the letter remains. Still sealed. Still unopened. A fragment of what might have been. A testament to what was lost, not just in the war, but in the quiet corners of human hearts. Number 26. Dudley's attempt to reconnect with Harry. Of all the stories tucked away in the shadowy margins of Harry Potter's post-Hogwarts life, few are as surprising, as quietly tender, and as forgotten as the strange, halting reconciliation between Harry and his childhood tormentor, Dudley Dursley. This is not a tale of dramatic spells or great battles. It is not about dark lords or ancient prophecies. This is about a letter, about clumsy words, about a boy raised to hate who decided almost too late to reach out his hand. Dudley Dursley was never the type to write letters. Growing up, he had mostly communicated in grunts, threats, and food orders. But somewhere in his early 20s, after Harry had married Ginny, after the Battle of Hogwarts had begun to fade into a painful but distant glow, a letter arrived at the Potter residence. The handwriting was messy, almost unreadable in places. The paper was crumpled, like it had been sat on, folded and refolded, maybe even torn and taped again. There were coffee stains on the edge, and the ink had smudged as if someone had sweated over the words. It was Dudley's handwriting. Harry recognized it instantly, having seen it sprawled across school forms, thank you cards dictated by Aunt Petunia, and the crude "keep out" signs taped to his cousin's door. But this time the message was different. Dudley was not demanding anything, not shouting in capital letters, not making a joke at Harry's expense. The letter read simply, "I don't know why we were like that. Maybe it's what we were taught. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just thought maybe someday we could eat together. No fists, no shoves, just people." Harry didn't respond, not right away. He read the letter, then he folded it, then he unfolded it. He showed it to no one, not Ginny, not Hermione. He tucked it between the pages of the Tales of Beedle the Bard, the old copy Dumbledore had left Hermione. It stayed there for 3 years. Dudley had grown in ways Petunia and Vernon never could have expected. After Harry left for Hogwarts for the last time, after the Dursleys spent a year under magical protection due to the Second Wizarding War, something in Dudley changed. Maybe it was the forced isolation from the comforts of little whinging. Maybe it was the absence of his parents' constant reinforcement of fear and superiority. Or perhaps it was that moment, shortly before they parted, when Dudley looked at Harry and said, "I don't think you're a waste of space." That sentence, unremarkable to most, had lingered with Harry more deeply than he admitted. Even in the Deathly Hallows, Rowling made note of it. Harry was stunned. Dudley had tears in his eyes. That moment, awkward and incomplete, planted a seed. And Dudley, slow as he was in most things, began to water it. He thought about Harry, he thought about magic. He even, on more than one occasion, Googled "wizard child raised in abusive home." Years passed. Harry had children. Dudley got married, surprisingly, to a woman named Amanda who worked in early childhood education and had a passion for restorative justice. She had never met Harry, but knew of him, and one day, during a particularly quiet dinner, Dudley confessed, "There was this boy, my cousin. He lived in the cupboard." Amanda asked the kind of questions Dudley had never been asked before. "Why? Did you ever apologize?" And most painfully, "Do you want to?" Dudley, fidgeting with his mashed potatoes, decided to write the letter. When Harry finally did respond years later, it wasn't with words. It was with an invitation, a small cafe in Muggle London, neutral territory. Ginny insisted on coming along, but Harry asked her to stay behind. This is mine," he told her quietly. "Something I have to do without wands." Dudley was waiting outside the cafe. He looked older, broader, but strangely deflated. His once permanent scowl had been replaced by something resembling shyness. He wore a grey jumper and too tight jeans. Harry approached him slowly, memories flooding back, of being shoved into shrubs, of taunts and smirks, of stolen birthday cakes. But those memories didn't come with anger now. They came with curiosity. The meal was uncomfortable. The waitress dropped a fork. Neither of them made a joke. Dudley spilled water on the table, and Harry reflexively dried it with his sleeve. They ordered sandwiches. Dudley picked at his chips. He said eventually, "I don't know what to say." Harry nodded. "You said it in the letter." "I didn't say sorry." "You didn't need to." This wasn't forgiveness, not quite. It was something adjacent. A ceasefire, a hand extended, palm up, not demanding anything in return. That meeting didn't change the world. No spells were cast. No ancient grievances erased. But when Harry got home, he took the letter out of the Tales of Beedle the Bard and placed it in a small wooden box labelled Personal. In the years that followed, Harry and Dudley exchanged letters. Not often, twice a year at most. Dudley always wrote by hand. Harry answered in neat, magical script that sometimes moved on the page. Dudley never commented on the moving ink. He told Harry about his job in a security firm, about Amanda's obsession with puzzles, about the birth of their daughter, Lily, not named after Harry's mother, but a coincidence that made Harry laugh out loud. "She's got your hair," Dudley wrote once, "which is weird because she's not even yours." Harry responded with stories about James, Albus, and Lily. He avoided mentioning magic directly, but hinted at odd school subjects. Dudley never asked. He understood boundaries now. He never brought up the cupboard under the stairs. One year, Dudley invited the Potters to a picnic in Surrey. Ginny was sceptical. Him? After all those years? But Harry insisted. He's trying. They went. It was sunny. Their children played in the grass. Lily Potter tripped and scraped her knee. Dudley's daughter gave her a Band-Aid and a chocolate coin. No one mentioned Hogwarts. No one asked about Voldemort. But when the children began playing tag, Dudley said quietly, "I used to chase you like that, but it wasn't a game." Harry replied, "I know." And that, somehow, was enough. In the last known letter from Dudley to Harry, dated May 2nd, an unintentional but poignant choice, Dudley wrote, "Sometimes I dream about Mum and Dad, about the way they were, about how they made us." He added, "I think if I'd gone to Hogwarts, I would have been in Hufflepuff. Amanda says that's the house with the big heart." Harry wrote back, "I think you're right." And Petunia, "She might have been a Slytherin. That's not an insult." There were no pictures of the two cousins together, no holiday cards exchanged, just letters, honest, slow and clumsy. The relationship was never loud, but in a life where so much had been torn apart by cruelty and fear, this quiet rebuilding felt more magical than any spell. In time, Dudley sent Harry a small package, a photo album. Inside were pictures of Dudley as a child, including some Harry had never seen. One, from a Christmas morning, showed a very small Harry in oversized pajamas, sitting behind Dudley by the tree. Aunt Petunia's legs were visible, Vernon's slippers. Harry was smiling, not at anyone, just smiling. A toy car sat beside him. A note read, "I think this was the year we forgot to separate the gifts." Harry stared at that picture for a long time. Then he placed it next to the family photo of the Potters on the mantel. Ginny said nothing. She just took his hand. Years later, when James Sirius Potter was told about the Dursleys, he asked, "Were they like Death Eaters?" Harry smiled. "No, just scared. And people who are scared, they do things they regret." And in a trunk at the bottom of the attic, in a small wooden box marked Personal, sat a letter, folded and refolded, smudged and stained, still carrying the weight of something that almost didn't happen. A boy who once chased his cousin with fists and later reached out with words. A letter not asking for forgiveness, but offering peace. A letter that changed everything, quietly and forever.